All right, welcome everybody. We're continuing. Balance this out. There we go, kind of. Sorry, I'm just trying to make it perfect since I'm the cameraman and everything else. Welcome to Clashing Worldviews in the U.S. Supreme Court. We're going to continue chapter 8 and then get to chapter 9, okay? One of the things I was looking back at what we talked about 2 weeks ago, okay? And I realized I really didn't focus on this, and I think I'm trying to help you understand this a little bit, and this is a little bit of constitutional law. But the issue with Bowers, okay, with the legalization of homosexual conduct and the constitutional means by which it was argued by the lawyers, you need to understand this, okay, because this affects us today on a lot of issues, okay? Remember we talked about the 14th Amendment, okay? And within the 14th Amendment, there's three key elements. One is, and all of this was for the freed African American slaves, right, after the Civil War. Equal protection under the laws, due process rights. Due process is what? Having a lawyer, have an attorney, Miranda warnings, okay, things like that, right? You have the right to remain, in other words, things that government must do before it takes away your life, liberty, and property. Can the government take away your life, liberty, and property? Yes, it can, if it follows all of these procedures. Because again, and that's a limitation on the government, then that protects you and I, right? So they can't just forcibly come in your house and take you away. Okay, why? Is there probable cause? Do you have a warrant? Did a judge sign for it? Okay, all of that's due process. The African American slaves didn't have any of that prior to the war, okay? So you got equal protection, due process, and then privileges and immunities, okay? And we talked about something called selective incorporation. What is that? Remember that? That is where the Supreme Court starts applying the Bill of Rights and limiting state governments. Because originally the Bill of Rights was written to limit which section of the government? Do you remember? Okay, so in the First Amendment, it says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Which section of the government is limited there? When it says Congress shall make no law. Is Congress a state government or is it national government? It's national. Okay, so prior to the 14th Amendment, and there was a case called Barron versus Baltimore that upheld this in the court, the Bill of Rights didn't apply to the states. It didn't limit state governments. Okay. After the 14th Amendment, what started happening is, and it didn't happen for about 60 years, but the Supreme Court started saying, hey, the 14th Amendment limits state governments, and we're going to start striking down all kinds of state legislation if it's seen to be unconstitutional and violates the first 10 Bill of Rights. Okay, this is where we get Miranda warnings, having to have a warrant for a police to search your house. Okay, in other words, that originally applied to the feds, just the FBI. Didn't apply to the police. Now, state governments had provisions, but it didn't apply. Does that make sense? I'm trying to bring you up to speed here to Bowers, okay? Okay, how do you get a constitutional justification for homosexual conduct from the Constitution? The argument goes something like this. There is a right to privacy that people have in their bedrooms that the government has no business meddling with. So homosexual conduct in the privacy of one's home, should not be meddled with by the government. Okay, government being the state law, whether it's police or something like that, okay? And they argued it, they used the due process clause of the 14th Amendment, okay? This is significant, so just bear with me, okay? In the due process clause are things like marriage. In other words, there's some form of due process that's followed before you get a wet marriage license, right? You got to go to the courthouse. Don't you have to apply for one? Okay. The government's got its business in something that God ordained. Okay, that was not always so, but it is now, right? Civil government has something to say about whether or not you get married. And you can see where gay marriage down the line on this, okay? So that's due process. Dealing with family, dealing with child rearing, different things like that. And so the argument that the proponents for homosexual conduct made was, hey, the 14th, in other words, individuals who are denied homosexual conduct in the privacy of their home are denied due process. Because what happened with Bowers? He was found in the act. He was arrested. He was thrown in. Was his liberty denied him? Yes, it was. He was in jail. So, in other words, so they made that argument from the due process clause. Does that make sense? Okay. And it involves an expanded view of liberty. Okay. In other words, this idea of the liberty of you and I as an American citizen to do whatever we want can be argued through the due process clause. Okay? I'm not trying to get into this too deep, okay? And there's something called, instead of due process, which is all the procedures, Miranda warnings, an attorney, a jury trial, no police brutality, okay, right? There's also something called substantive due process. Well, what is that? That is, even if the Constitution doesn't say so, just the principles of common sense, I'm making this very simple. The principles of common sense would say that, hey, even though the Constitution doesn't say you can or can't, common sense says you should be able to. Okay? In other words, does that give a lot of latitude to the courts to interpret however they want? Sure they do. Okay? And so the argument that was made in Bowers is common sense says if you grant one particular sexuality, heterosexuality freedom, you should be able to grant them that. Okay? The pushback to that, and that's what Harry Blackmun was all for. Okay? William Rehnquist and Justice White were against it because they said, wait a minute, if you're going to make something like homosexual conduct legal and you're arguing from substantive due process, in order to keep substantive due process from going off the rails and allowing chaos to reign in this country, it's got to be bounded by something called ordered liberty and within the history of our country. In other words, did the founding generation allow homosexual conduct to be practiced freely in America? The answer is no. So a judge can't make it so today. Does that make sense? In other words, a more conservative judge will go, hey, I know you're trying to get this here, but it wasn't here at our founding, so we can't just go ahead and make this thing up and inject our policy preferences in it. If you want your right, get it through legislation or an amendment. Does that make sense? So that's what's going on here. Okay, I want to, because I realized, you know what, I never really even developed this idea. So if you can see here in the section of the book, I'm just reading this. Chief Justice Rehnquist, let me get back. There it is. So basically, Justice White in Bowers attacked this idea of the right to privacy, okay? Because the right to privacy had already been in law since 1965. What's the right to privacy? It's this idea that there's this zone around me and there's this zone around you as citizens that we can do whatever we want and the government can't do anything about it. And the issue with right to privacy came about in a case in 1965, basically that dealt with contraceptives. Prior to 1965, you had to go to the doctor as a married couple to get contraceptives. You couldn't just go get them. My how times have changed, okay? That argument was used to justify abortion. A woman has a zone of privacy. Government can't regulate if you want to terminate your baby. Okay? That same logic was being argued by Blackmun and the attorneys to say that, hey, there's a zone of privacy around a person's bedroom, even if you're homosexual, government can't regulate that. Okay? So it's an expanded view of liberty. We are autonomous, we can do whatever I want, and government can't tell us we can't. Okay? And so let me just read this section, this might help. So, unlike fundamental rights found by the court in such areas as family connections, marriage, or reproduction, based on the Due Process Clause in the 5th and 14th Amendments, Justice White denied the right to privacy in Griswold versus Connecticut. That's the contraception case. Extended Due Process Clause protections to homosexual sodomy. Okay, in other words, so again, the idea of substantive due process, is this idea that even though the Constitution doesn't say it, common sense and the fact that it was originally around at the founding says it's legal today. legalization of homosexual conduct was not around at the founding, and was not, it was something that was, it's a newer thing, okay? In other words, had the practice been around since the beginning? Sure, because there's something called sin. And sin leads to sexual brokenness in myriad forms. Only one consequence is homosexuality. You can pick your issue. There's all kinds of abuse, okay? Does that make sense? So Rehnquist and White are like, no, that doesn't give us carte blanche that we just say, yeah, that's totally cool because we want it to be cool today, and justices impatient for social change within legislation. Hey, state legislatures aren't doing it, we'll do it ourselves. Okay? Rehnquist and White are like, no, we're not expanding the due process clause. You can't do that. Okay? So Rehnquist mirrored the same argument in the Glucksberg case. Remember the Glucksberg case? We talked about it. Do we legalize euthanasia? And Rehnquist said, no, we don't do that. Okay, now here's the logic. And again, it's the same logic in Bowers. Rehnquist pointed out the necessity of clearly defining liberty interests when using substantive due process analysis. In other words, hey, does common sense and due process mean that we should allow homosexuality to reign throughout America? He says, no. Okay, why? Noting the heightened protection that fundamental rights and liberties enjoy, along with the ambiguity within defining these rights, Rehnquist argued that they require considerable clarification in order to be accepted by the court. Okay, in other words, what is he saying? He's saying all of this unclearness, okay, in other words, because remember, this is 1986, okay? Homosexual conduct legally through the country was thought unthinkable. And so Rehnquist and the court is going, should we allow something that was unthinkable now and unthinkable at the founding suddenly to be okay today? No, you can't do that. Again, get your own legislation. In other words, if your idea is so great, if your liberty is so great, win the hearts and minds of your state and get legislation passed, or win the hearts and minds of America and get an amendment passed, or get Congress to pass a law, or something like that. But again, this is a state issue. Because remember, health, morals, marriage, in the Constitution was always supposed to be dealt with which branch of government? Local government, state government. It was never meant to be dealt with at the national level through the Supreme Court. And that's why homosexual conduct was regulated up until 2003. Does that make sense? So you know, because again, it's a conservative is going to, because a conservative Protestant, because we value the scriptures, we're also going to correspondingly value the Constitution. And we're going to say, wait a minute, even as we are bound by the scriptures because of life and conduct behavior, in the same way we revere and respect something written and codified, and so we're not going to manipulate it. So we would be very quick to say, hey, homosexuals, you want your conduct. And even if we, again, from a biblical perspective, see that practice as abhorrent, okay? Respect for all people says, okay, then win the hearts and minds of Americans the right way and get legislation or an amendment passed. That's the wisdom of the founders. Because they did not want radical social engineering to happen from the court. Because what do you do when that happens? You bypass the American people. You bypass legislature. You bypass argument and persuasion. Okay? And that's exactly what the advocates of the sexual revolution in homosexuality have done. They are very shrewd tacticians. And they realize we cannot win the hearts of Americans through legislation. We can't. So we will do other means. One of which was, we talked about the courts. We also talked about media. We also talked about changing sympathies. Portray yourself as a victim. We also talked about the fact that they hitched their cause to the civil rights wagon. So how dare you hinder my civil rights? Is the issue of pigmentation and melanin in skin tone the same as sexual? No, it's not. They're two different things. They're two totally different things. But that's what they argue. And they've been very shrewd. And what does Jesus say? The people of this world are far shrewder than the children of light. And that's how they've done it. Okay? So anyway, I'm trying to show you the constitutional means, but by which they argue, and they use the due process clause, because within the due process clause is things like marriage and marriage licenses. And so that's where the Obergefell, the gay marriage case, that's how it was argued. And at the core is an expanded version of liberty. Liberty means whatever I want. And so the court better give it to us. I would say, we would say as conservative Protestants, get your own amendment, get your own legislation. Okay? Thoughts or questions? Again, I hadn't covered that, and I wanted to make sure we understood that from the constitutional perspective. Debbie, you got a question?
No, I was just thinking back to Balaam, when he was supposed to curse Israel, he couldn't. So he went in the back door, said, marry him off to heathen women, and that's how they got sin into the camp. Here, legislators said, well, we can't come out and say homosexual is wrong, so we're going to come in a different way and deceive you. So it's a long time thing.
Yeah, and it's again, I've referenced this book, forgive me if I keep repeating myself, but the book After the Ball, that was written by a Harvard psychologist and another Harvard marketer. And they said, how can we win the hearts and minds of Americans with homosexuality? And the argument they make in the book is what I just said. And they said, and the analogy they give is, how does a camel get into a tent? It first slips its nose underneath the tent. And if it can get its nose in, it can get the rest of the body in. And they said, that's what we're going to do within American culture. Through the courts, through TV shows, through the civil rights movement, through labeling ourselves as victims. And by and large, that strategy's worked.
And he literally listed that out as strategy.
Mm-hmm. It's in the book. I read the book. Yeah. That book was written in 1990, and they've done it. That's exactly what they did. The very thing they said, we're going to do this, they've done. Yeah, so it's not like by accident. It's like, oh my gosh, why are so many gay characters in TV shows now? It's by design. It's because they said, again, there's something in psychology called systematic desensitization. What is systematic? Keep exposing somebody to something over time, and the shock value of it diminishes every time you see it. To where suddenly, like, I guess it's fine. In fact, not only is it fine, it's normal. Not only is it normal, I'm going to celebrate it and defend it against all. Again, that's the psychology element of the book coming through. That's what they've done. That's how you do it.
What do you see they're doing now? What are they trying to sneak through us?
Well, what are they doing now? What's the next leg of the sexual revolution? I mean, it's just complete and I mean, think of the frontiers, okay, without getting too pedophilia, polyamory. Hey, if love is love and love wins, and if I, as an adult, love a 13-year-old girl or an 8-year-old girl, or if, hey, having 4 or 5 women and 4 or 5 men as marriage, because if love is love and love wins, and then what's to stop the complete and total, obliteration of any kind of distinctions that we have in some of these areas? There's no end. It's okay. What are we talking about? This is called paganism. This is what I shared last Sunday, and I've shared this many times. This is Isaiah chapter 1. Unless the Lord had left us a remnant, we'd become like Sodom and Gomorrah. That's what it's. America is repaganizing. Western culture is going back to the first century Greco-Roman world, where they had no problem with homosexuality, they had no problem with abortion, they had no problem with euthanasia, they had no problem with gladiatorial games. I mean, Austin and I were watching a football game yesterday, and they had a commercial on about a boxing. And he goes, Dad, boxing's so old. Whereas I grew up, with Muhammad Ali, and that was a big deal. And now they've got the cage fight. I mean, it's brutal. Isn't it resembling more like, if you've ever watched it, I've watched a glimpse of it, not a lot. It's like a gladiator. I mean, they're basically just beating the tar out of people without gloves to where they're on the ground. I mean, it's merciless. It's repaganization in America. That's where we're going. Yeah, in other words, unless grace steps in, all of us, the culture is going to go that way. So that's why we take a stand. That's why we take a stand. Anyway.
But we be the remnant.
Huh?
We be the remnant.
Right, yeah.
We be the one.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. If you remember, I gave an account, Larry Taunton, Okay, he's a Christian. He's on CNN and Fox News a lot. Strong Christian guy. Knows critical race theory because he's got a PhD in Marxism. He's sharp. And his son went to Yale Law School. And he said, Dad, I can tell you what's happening after the gay marriage case, in Bergefell, because he was in law school right after that. He said, they being the legal eagles at Yale, the elites, they see Christianity and Christian belief as the speed bump that prevents that agenda from going through. So they are focusing all of their intellectual firepower on removing Christianity and its influence in the public square, because they see that's what's preventing all of this stuff from going through. So if you say, what's next? I can tell you this much: the legal profession is focusing all of their effort and energies on diminishing, again, Christianity in law in key areas, so that there's nothing to stop. Because if we don't, who else is telling that, hey, wait, stop, don't, what are we doing? Who else is doing that? And that's why, yeah. Okay, lots to think about, lots to do, right? Lots. So I'm going to close with this in this chapter, and then we're going to move on to chapter 9, okay? Again, this is key, I think. I said it in the book. The key difference in dealing with homosexuality from a theological perspective is, again, a different conception of God. From a conservative Protestant standpoint, God stands outside of the creation. He created it, but he stands outside of it. He holds it accountable to his character and his standard. Again, Genesis 1:26 through 28, in the beginning he made them male and female, because we're made in his image, right? So that is that is ultimate, that is authoritative for us, right? So that's how we're looking for, that's how we view Bruce Jenner, Caitlyn, right? That's how we view transgender bath. We're going to be like, whoa, that's a violation of created order. Because we realize he's the creator, we're not. We don't create the rules. We don't create humans and human sexuality and the binaries between the sexes. God did. So that view causes us to look at this in a particular way, okay? So truth is fixed and permanent. It's unaffected by changing society, right? So God stands outside that. But again, progressive Protestants look at God as immanent. They stress God's immanence. Again, God is transcendent. He's higher. He's created all of this, but he steps in it through the power of his Holy Spirit, through the incarnation, but he's not beholden to it. Okay? Progressive Protestants, they stress God's immanence, that God is embedded within. They don't look at him as transcendent so much as he's immanent. So as the flow of society moves and ebbs and flows and changes, God's in it. God's embedded within it. So they see all of these iterations, all these expressions of sexuality going on. What's wrong with it? Because God's in it. Remember, we talked about this earlier. The influence of Hegel, okay, is huge. This idea that again, the most current expression of society, freeze-frame society right now, right? October 3rd, 20, and you look at what is going on. We've got transgender bathrooms, we've got gay marriage, we've got homosexuality championed in our culture. That is the most rational expression of what it means to be human. That is true. Okay? Because Hegel based his understanding of truth on historicism. Again, this flow of history, the real is the rational is the real. That's what he said. So newest is truest, latest is greatest. So that influence, coupled with a God that's embedded with society. And Hegel said this: the march of the state is the march of God in the world. So as the state is making decisions on things, that's God. And if you happen to have the what's the word I want to say? The incredibly awesome position of being a Supreme Court justice and get to decide what ethics are, well, gosh, you've got an awful lot of power to be the voice of God in the earth. Okay? All of that affects progressive Protestantism. So they're looking at homosexuality, and not only are they saying it's okay, they're getting angry at you for saying it's wrong. Because you're hindering God. God is in that. Because again, if God is here, and then whatever's going on must be God. Remember, progressive Protestantism is a theology from below. It's based on human reason, what we think. It's based on human feelings, what we feel. It's what James says in James chapter 3, verses 14 and 16, right? He talks about the wisdom that is from below is earthly, sensual, of the devil. In other words, it's an earthly understanding of what it means to be human. That's what drives them. Whereas our view is from a God's eye view, looking down based on what he has said, because his word is authoritative. Okay? So that's a big key of why you're looking at it the way you're looking at it, and why they're looking at it like they're looking at it. Okay? Does that make sense? Thoughts? Questions? That's really important. Okay? I just finished this morning. Again, I kind of already talked about all this, but you familiar with deconstruction? Maybe not. A lot of Christian pastors, a lot of Christian bloggers, a lot of Christian music artists are deconstructing right now. They're walking away from the faith, and they're deconstructing everything they held that is true because of they have had an experience that contradicts. They've got a friend who becomes gay, and they value that experience greater than God's word. So they are questioning their faith, so they're walking away from God. One of the members of DC Talk, remember you heard of DC Talk? Totally walked away, totally deconstructed. He's gone. Okay, it's not Michael Tate, and it's not the other guy that does all the rap stuff. It's another. But anyway, but that whole thing is going on, and a lot of it is because these young people, and not young, old, they put experiences and feelings above the word and who God is. And that's the same thing that drives this case. In other words, it's the same thing. It's which theology are you going to allow to determine your view of God and life? Is it from above or is it from below? Because I know a guy. I got a friend. I talked with somebody who I have known for 30 years, a couple of years ago, and he knew I was a pastor. We've been friends. We worked together. He knew I was back from Illinois. Hey, let's have lunch. Met with him, talked with him, found out his son came out as gay, and he was looking for my endorsement, my thoughts and my endorsement. And I came out and said, that's sexual sin that needs to be repented of just like any other. And he looked at me like, what was wrong? What's wrong with you? It's my son. He's my son. And if he has those feelings and he feels he was born that way, how can you look at the Bible and say that he's born that way? How can you? And I spent the next awkward hour with him and he is allowing his compassion and his emotional attachment and loyalty to his son trump God's word. That same concept is fueling all of this deconstruction. That's where when Jesus talks about the great falling away, I believe that's part of it. Is we allow, again, where do you do your theology from? From above or below? Below says human reason and feelings.
So then how can the pastors that are falling towards this homosexual thing that it's okay because it's supposedly of God, how can they say that they know God and they believe everything that's from below rather than from what's above? How can they justify that? I just cannot get that in my head that when my sister come out and said she was a lesbian, all I could think of was, what sin are you in? You're in such deep sin. You've got to get out of that. And that's exactly what I expressed to her. She got angry, but eventually she accepted Christ as Lord. Because she knew by reading scriptures and things like that, that God was above everything. So I can't understand how pastors who say they know the Lord, they believe in God, they follow the scriptures, turn around and say, well, my nephew just turned homosexual and I have to go with that. That's okay.
Okay, let me respond with a question back to you. What do you know? Tell me 5 aspects of progressive Protestantism that might lead them to think that. Can you mention some of the key things? I'll help you out. That God is immanent. God is not high above. Okay, so that's one. What else? Everyone else can weigh in. Because this leads to the answer to Joanna's question. It's a great question. What do we know about progressive Protestants that would lead them to discount what the Bible says about homosexuality and embrace it and champion it?
Well, we're made in the image of God for one thing.
Okay, right, but from progressive Protestantism, from their standpoint, God is immanent, so God doesn't stand outside of his creation and hold it accountable. What else?
God is amongst his people.
Right. Debbie, what do you think? I know you got several. Go.
Society is what, forget it.
Okay, so let me help you out. Okay, just
They don't
so.
have the truths of the Bible.
Okay, so yeah, the Bible is viewed with suspicion, or is a lesser authority than science and human reason. That's big, right? Because right there, if you challenge the word and it's not as authoritative, then why wouldn't you accept all? It just makes sense, right? So you've got that. Human nature is basically good. In other words, they reject sin. Remember we talked about one of the key aspects of progressive Protestantism that you see by the 1930s is no altar calls. Lord, why would you need to give your life to Christ if you're basically good? A rejection of a literal hell. So again, there's no fear of the Lord. Okay, okay, so you got that. And then I'm trying to think, so this idea of flow, again, the flow of society is authoritative, not a fixed and transcendent reference point from the Bible, right? What's the other aspect of progressive Protestantism? Something called mediation. Mediation is this idea that we need to make the Bible palatable for modern people. So if the supernatural offends, we'll downplay it. If a biblical view of homosexuality offends, we'll downplay it. In other words, because if you start accommodating and mediating this idea that, hey, we need to make the Bible rational and accepted and, well, here's the big word, relevant, then we will start pushing down those areas. Okay, all of that leads to why progressive pastors are so accepting of it. Because, God's reduced, the Bible's reduced, human nature is misunderstood, we're not sinners, right? The flow of culture is elevated. There is no hell. There's no altar calls. Many of them, many of them might be born again. That's the scary thing about it. Many of them are, but many aren't either. So does that help answer your question? Those beliefs affect how they view those things.
I understand all of that, but I can't, for me to turn and say, God's not in it, lower the Bible to a lower standard, I can't do that. I can't see how someone who's been preaching the gospel and saying they are maybe born again, that they would turn that way and take everything and throw it to the side like it was nothing because somebody became a homosexual in their family or they knew someone.
Well,
But that's very
the whole seeker movement, the whole
Yes.
seeker-friendly churches is doing just that too. And you got a ton of churches across the United States right now that are seeker-friendly.
And in those seeker-friendly churches, and I can't remember the exact quote, but basically, as one seeker-friendly pastor said, the audience drives our message. I mean, that's no different than Madison Avenue advertising. Or in other words, we are catering to the people and what the people want and what the people want to hear. Now, They may not say it as crassly as I just said it, but that causes you, and let me just say, be candid as a pastor. There's incredible pressure. Thank God this church isn't this way, but I still feel it. Growing the church, being successful, as they say, noses and nickels, people and finances. Okay, that's pressure on a pastor in a 21st century American world to pay the bills and all that kind of stuff. Well, if you really allow that to drive you, then you will do whatever you can to make people like you and the message and all of that kind of stuff. And in the process, God's authoritative word gets pushed to the wayside to some degree and somewhere. And you see that kind of stuff. You do. Because the pressure to keep, we've built all these buildings and we've got this great TV ministry and we've got this and that and the other thing, and we better keep the good times rolling and the money flowing, or I'm going to hear it from my leadership team. That pressure is very real, okay, on pastors, which causes many of them to bail.
See, the pressure of that ought to be for kingdom business, for salvation and kingdom business.
Can you say that again? I didn't hear all.
I said it ought to be, the motivation ought to be for kingdom business and salvation, not fill the pews so we can water down the message.
Os Guinness calls the seeker-sensitive movement, I love his phrase, he calls it the Gravedigger Thesis. And this idea that churches and pastors are digging their own graves by catering to an audience. You'll have initial growth, but it will come back to bite you. Because you are not developing Christians and discipleship and the truth of the word preached, and it cannot stand. It can't. I mean, that's why you've got, So.
And all those people that are under them begin to flow in that way, and it just.
Well, hey, that's a sobering thing as a pastor. The people in our church, over time, become a reflection of my preaching. Not exclusive, but you know what I'm saying, where Paul talks about your living letters. Hey, if you don't believe my teaching, just look at the people that are following me and this teaching. You'll see very clearly if what I'm saying is the truth.
Yeah.
No pressure as a leader. And you can see where in seeker-sensitive churches, if you're not hearing that word, and then you begin to look at them. I am reminded of a story. Billy Graham's in an airplane, true story, airline, flying. This guy is standing next to him, and he's reading his Bible, and he's drunk, and he's like, he's like, hey, what's going on? He said, oh yeah, I'm reading my Bible. He's like, good grief, well, you're kind of drunk. He said, well, I'm one of your disciples. And he said, yeah, you're probably one of my disciples, because if you were Jesus' disciple, you wouldn't be doing that. In other words, this idea of if we don't stand on the word and preach it, the sobering component of any kind of pastoral ministry or leadership, those people will start emulating you. They will, in your word and what you're saying, for better or for worse. And I'll have to answer to Jesus for that. So will every pastor.
Yes.
It's a sobering thing.
And every parent. When your child tells you, who is adult, tells you that if you love me, and you do love a child, if you love me, you will vote to protect my rights, or we can't have a relationship. So, it's God. My relationship is with God, and if you don't accept, where I stand, then yes, we're separated.
Yeah.
Because the prodigal's going to come home.
Right. And you can't, and what I hear from that, because we've talked, is I hear a child elevating politics to an idol.
Yes.
Because if politics becomes the dividing point within a family, then obviously God is not their God. Obviously a political party or an ideology is ultimate. And the Bible relativizes all of that. In Christ there is no slave, Jew, free, male, female, right? Republican, Democrat, communist,
that's where some parents
socialist.
would cave.
Yeah, and that's where my friend who I was talking to, who had the gay son, caved. Okay, I'm going to go with my feelings, my loyalty, familial. Can family become an idol? Can familial ties become an idol? Yes, idolatry is myriad. I mean, there's no end. You start going on that road and really looking at it, you're like, good grief. We rag on India for having 300 million gods. America has 320 million people times 320 million gods and then some. You know, I mean, it's never ending. We've changed idols of the shelf for idols of the self. And we are very capable. Like Calvin said, we are idol factories. This brain, your brain, is an idol factory, save the grace of God.
The thing about it is if the pastor would stand firm, as Ruth has stood firm, as I stood firm, my sister wouldn't talk to me for the longest time. And I started giving her Bible passages about homosexuality. And she would get furious with me. But I stood my ground. I was not going to have her go into that kind of a lifestyle and stay in there like that. And she'd been in it already for years. But eventually, as she started reading the Bible, because she started becoming miserable, because her mate walked out on her. And that was probably the best thing that could have happened to her. Because after that, she didn't know what to do.
Homosexuals are fully capable of having relational problems, just like married couples do.
Yes.
Because of sin nature, man. It'll come back and bite you. It's called reality.
Yeah, it's really
If you don't
a sad
have
thing
Jesus,
to see that, but
they're
if you
fully
stand
capable.
firm with them, there's always the chance that they'll come to the Lord and give up that lifestyle.
and that's where, you stand firm. You know what it says in
Yeah, you
Ephesians
have to
about
stand firm.
stand.
When you can't, when there's nothing else to do, the word says stand.
Stand. Yeah, that's it.
Your story, Joanna, has obviously a happy ending. Unfortunately, there's many, many, many that have not. And as
And I know that.
My brother has disowned me for years because I don't condone his homosexual lifestyle. I have not spoken to Chris in almost probably 18 years, 20 years. He wants nothing to do with me. He's made that quite clear. Nor does he my other sister, because she also, which is his twin, because she is a Christian and they're not in the ministry. So it costs, and there's a deep cost.
I'll tell you, it was very hard because I kept putting my face in front of her, and she hated that. She didn't want me to, she wouldn't even answer her door sometimes when I'd come to her house. But I was determined that she was not gonna live that lifestyle.
Yeah. And that's the key.
Despite your determination, though, you really could not make her do anything different.
No,
And
it was
a
her
very big
choice.
cost, I understand that, but there's a huge cost.
Yeah, it was her choice. It was her choice to do what she wanted to do.
And Jesus talked about counting the cost.
Yeah.
And hey, if the world hates you, realize it hates me first, so don't feel special. Right? I mean, we're all in and that's the thing. We live in a fallen world. It's dark. It's in rebellion towards God. John 3, where it says, hey, the world doesn't want to walk in the light. They want to go back in the shadows. And that's where all the strongholds begin, because the deception's in our head. And suddenly, I'm right and I'm justified. And blah, blah, blah. Yeah, you got I love you, but you got a stronghold. It needs to be broken off of you. We need to take captive those thoughts. Yeah. All right. Can we move on?
Yeah.
Do we solve everything? Stand firm. Don't cave.
That's right.
Right? Don't
Stand
love
firm.
people as much as you can, but don't
Get
cave.
in their face.
Yeah, and
Get
you've
in
gotta,
their face.
if we don't take a stand, if the salt loses its saltiness, then what are we doing? Yeah.
And I'll tell you, it hurts.
Sure it does.
It hurts
sure
real hard when
does.
somebody slams the door in your face and it's your
Yeah.
sister.
Yeah, it does. And that's, but if we make family affiliation an idol, we're not serving Jesus and we're being unfaithful to our Lord. And that's, again, some people step it up. My friend caved.
Yeah.
And now is going to a support group with other Christian parents of kids who are gay that justifies the lifestyle. So, okay. So we get to chapter 9. Okay, what's in chapter 9? Chapter 9 is, okay, let's follow the logic of conservative Protestantism and progressive Protestantism to its logical conclusion in things like liberty, equality, and justice. Okay, what is liberty? What is equality? And what is justice from a biblical perspective? As a conservative Protestant, what is it from a progressive Protestant if they reject that, if you follow the logic out? Because so our goal in chapter 9 was, we realized that Blackmun and Rehnquist weren't ruling on things like sexual orientation and gender identity laws. And we realized they weren't dealing with transgender bathrooms. And however, if you follow the logic of their thinking up to now, what would they have said? Okay, so again, this gives us a preview of, again, why you think the way you do. And this is important, I think, for Christians. As American citizens, what is liberty? What does equality really mean? You know, is homosexual marriage really equal to heterosexual marriage in the eyes of God? You know, I'm reminded of what Abraham Lincoln said when he was dealing with the slavery issue in his Lincoln-Douglas debates. And slavery was all the rage in 1858 when they had those debates. And he said this: you cannot institute equality between right and wrong. In other words, the guy who was debating, Stephen Douglas, was saying, hey, every state, let them vote up or down slavery however they please. And Lincoln said, wait a minute, hold on. That sounds really great, and that sells, but is that really morally true? If two things are fundamentally incompatible, they are not equal. That is not equality. True equality is not making right wrong and wrong right. You can't. Lincoln was brilliant. I mean, Lincoln was he's probably my favorite president, just because the Union was falling apart, and he brought it together by going back to the Declaration of Independence and saying, this is our foundation stone as Americans if we're going to move forward. We cannot go forward unless we go back. And that is so counterintuitive today. Let's burn all that stuff down. Okay? Which brings me to my point. Okay? So when we're talking about conservative Protestantism and progressive Protestantism, it's hard to say fast, we're talking about, are we going to go the way of the Reformation, or are we going to go the way of the Enlightenment? Okay? The Reformation, sola scriptura, scriptures alone, sola fides, faith in Christ. In other words, conservative Protestants believe reason with revelation is how you move forward. Progressive Protestants is reason without revelation. That's the Enlightenment. Okay? And so Enlightenment rationalism, which gives us a lot of really great things, but a lot of all really bad. Enlightenment rationalism, every time you go to your dentist to get your teeth looked at, right? Enlightenment rationalism and the science behind that gave us a lot of that. But it also gave us the Holocaust, and it gave us, Chairman Mao, and a lot of really bad things, okay? But if there's no revelation to moderate it humanely, it's going to get off the rails, okay? America is at a crossroads. Okay, are we going to go that way or not? Or you could say, in more modern parlance, are we going to go the way of 1776 or the 1789 French Revolution? That's what's happening in America right now. Okay, Abraham Lincoln said this: how can a nation remain forever slave and free? It can't. Okay, in other words, he's saying America's you can't keep going in these two, something's going to win out, okay? Either the principles of our founding, or what's the French Revolution, okay? They rejected God. They rejected the monarch. They said human reason alone can lead a nation toward freedom. The French Revolution said freedom, liberty, and Christianity are two opposing things. We want freedom, we're getting rid of Christianity. And it led to the guillotine, right? They cut off 15,000 heads. I mean, it led to utter chaos. They put a goddess, they literally took a 14-year-old girl who was beautiful, and they put all of this garb on her to make her look like the goddess of reason, and they put her in the Cathedral of Notre Dame, and they bowed down and worshipped her. And they sang Catholic hymns to her, and they elevated human reason, okay? That fuels the Communist Revolution in 1917. That fuels the Chinese Revolution in 1949. That fuels revolutionary liberationism within the secular revolution today. A complete rejection of God, a complete elevation of reason, and now feelings as ultimate. That cannot coexist with the principles of our founding in 1776 and reason with revelation. So that's why when you start looking at what liberty is, what equality is, what justice is, you're going to start here with, okay, common terms, but you're going to go, whoa, we're going way in totally different directions. Okay? So that's what we're talking about here. Okay? That's at the forefront of what's going on, okay? You know, a big part of progressive Protestants, again, is they believe in this fact-value distinction, okay? If you can kind of see on the page, okay? Forgive me if that's a little fuzzy. But again, so this idea that theology and morality, the truths of Scripture, supernatural miracles, what it means to live ethically and moral from the Scriptures, that is upstairs. That's personal. That's private. That's subjective. Those are your own personal values. That's your own truth. What's really true is science, human reason. Okay, that's Enlightenment rationalism. Okay, there's nothing wrong with that. But if you've got science without morality, you start getting things like Auschwitz. And you start getting things like the 5-year famines in the Soviet Union in the 1930s by good old Papa Joe. And you get, we can pick your genocide. Okay? It's because of a rejection of any upward morality that says, wait a minute, hold on. You don't treat people that way, right? Every human life is sacred. You're mowing them down like they're, whatever, And so again, Enlightenment rationalism says only what scientifically can verify from the empirical scientific method is true and valid for the public square. Right?
Today when there is no science.
Science falsely called or pseudoscience, but this and even that, okay, even that right now, what we're dealing with vaccinations and Fauciism and all this kind of stuff, where you're like, okay, who is right and who's wrong and everything's politicized, that's a reflection of the worldview called postmodernism. Postmodernism is a skepticism of truth. America is a post-truth, post-constitutional society. We're even now, fake news, all of that plays in very much with the rejection of any fixed truth. So now we've got what's called tribalism in interest groups politics, in my truth and your truth, gay truth, white truth, black truth, female truth, male truth, right? You've heard that in the abortion debates. If a guy says champions life, how dare you? You don't have a womb. You have nothing to say about. Oh, really? Really? Truth has a gender? Really? Truth has a race? Does truth have a No, it doesn't. It doesn't have a race, nationality, or gender. So I should be able to speak the truth. But when you see people say that, that's postmodernism. That's a splintering of truth into your own individual interest group and value system. A nation is not sustainable that way. That is called, and that is the tactic of cultural Marxism. Okay? In other words, there are people within our country exploiting that because they want to balkanize and separate America. That's what's going on, because there's no capital T truth anymore. And now politics becomes just everyone's interest group going to the feeding trough of the government for rights and money. Okay? That is not sustainable. You can't America cannot continue half slave, half free. It can't. It cannot keep going that way. Okay,
They don't believe in valid for everyone.
Right, and yeah,
It's only for them.
This is actually modernism and modernity. Okay, once you get to postmodernism, this dividing line is somewhat blurred, in that my values, my feelings, my preferences become ultimate, but we have 325 million ultimates. Right, you can't sustain a nation that way. And again, this is what Friedrich Nietzsche said in his book Beyond Good and Evil. The guy that said God is dead didn't just say God is dead. He continued in his statement, but Christians wrongly just say he was bad. No, he said, you people in Europe in the 1890s are living as if God is dead. You Christians are basically practical atheists. You are living as if God is dead. And what will happen in a society if you start living as if God is dead? You claim to be Christians. Your Christianity is privately engaging, but publicly irrelevant. Let's look at what happens. He said, you know what will happen to a society that says God is dead and lives as if God is dead? The only thing that is true now is the will to power. It's not your argument. It's not your persuasion. It's not your legislation. It's who's got the votes, who's got the guns, who's got the power. And that's called power politics. That's what's going on in society. And people that want to be representatives in Congress we'll deal with that. In other words, and you'll see this where it's not what is true and right, is if it's powerful and if you've got votes and what Nietzsche foresaw was it will lead to the rise of somebody so powerful that can dominate everyone else, someone he called the Übermensch, a Superman. And he foretold the rise of Adolf Hitler. In other words, if a culture does not have truth anymore, and they live as if God is dead, the only thing that will keep a society in line is power, meaning more government control. What am I saying? Am I saying should go in politics? I'm saying it could help, but the church has got to be the church. If the church is the church, and the church proclaims the truth and lives the truth, it will keep conveying to your politicians. In other words, what is the role of government? To restrain sin and condone the good. How are they going to know what is sinful? How are they going to know what's good if we're not involved in it? Whether literally in an office or verbally and theologically and ecclesiologically involved as a church, as the people of God. We've got to do that because again, that's why you see elections rigged and no one bats an eye. That, because again, it doesn't matter. Hey, we have the power, we did it. There is no right and wrong anymore. There's nothing right and wrong. It's all whatever you want it to be, based on the power that you have. And we had the power, so we did it. So deal with it. Yeah, okay. Okay, I'm going the wrong way, sorry. Okay, so let's talk about this a little bit. Okay. Okay, what do I want to say here about... Sorry, there's lots to talk about, and I don't want to totally repeat what I just said, okay? Okay, liberty, okay? For a conservative Protestant, liberty is ordered, right? I'm going to talk about this morning in the sermon.
Okay, good.
First Corinthians 6:12. Everything is permissible for me, but not everything is beneficial. Okay, so we would say liberty needs to be ordered. Why? Is God absolutely free? Yes and no. He's the freest person in the universe, but he's not absolutely free. What do you mean? He's bound by his character. He will not do something outside of his character. Right?
Right.
So that same principle applies to humans made in his image. We are free to do whatever we want, but there are consequences if we go out of bounds outside of God's character. Right? Sowing and reaping. So we don't see liberty as absolute. We don't see every claim going to the government. I need to be free to have my college education paid for. I need to be free to have my retirement paid for by the government. We've already gotten used to that since 1937. But is the purpose of government to provide you for retirement? Is the purpose of government to provide you for free health care or free vacations? Okay? That's exactly what FDR said in his speech in 1944 to Congress. He said, listen, needy people are not free. That's the stuff of which dictators are made. And he's speaking he's speaking during World War II. He's looking at Germany in the 1920s after the Versailles Treaty and all of the reparations payments, and those people, inflation was just ridiculous. And it led to the rise of a dictator. So he said, you know what? Since you are needy, you are not free, I'm going to propose a second Bill of Rights. And I'm going to propose certain things like this. A right to retirement money, a right to education, a right to health care, a right to a home, a right to a job, a right to a wage that will pay you whatever you want or whatever you think is good for you, a right to a home. Okay? Does that sound a lot like what government is doing today? We got those ideas from FDR because in his mind, liberty is entitlements through government. Okay? From a progressive Protestant viewpoint, they're like, yeah, freedom through government. Okay? Conservative Protestants are like, wait a minute. So what has happened is the progressives take freedom for, what is our freedom for? Our freedom is for government to keep giving us stuff. That's what our freedom's for, right? From a conservative Protestant viewpoint, from the view of the founders, it's freedom to live a good and virtuous life, which will lead to happiness. In other words, the freedom to not be bound by government so you can make as much money as you want, go to as much school as you want, do what you want in such a way that you can enjoy the fruits of your labor. That's very different than what the progressives are advocating. Does that make sense?
The thing about it is that most of the time, we're the ones that putting the money into what we're getting back.
Our
Right.
retirement,
We're not-
we
yeah.
paid in and our
Yeah.
employer paid in, not the government.
We paid into Social Security, we paid into Medicare, and whatever else we needed, we always paid into everything. So what they're trying to give us back is what we've paid into them already, and when we've worked 50, 60 years,
Yeah.
that's what they
But
feel
see-
we deserve.
Yeah, and that's the viewpoint of progressive Protestantism, and progressivism in general, is you cannot be free unless government provides X for you. So who becomes your savior? Who becomes your source? And haven't we had a whole entitlement society created because of that?
Yes, we
Yeah.
have.
Yes.
For
And,
decades
and,
past.
and it's very hard when that becomes institutionalized to break out of it.
Oh,
You know, because you try to break people out of it, and it changes and you have generations of people now with that mindset. Okay, go back to conservative Protestantism in the founding, okay, of our country. Okay, the first Americans were pilgrims, settlers, adventurers, entrepreneurs who came to our shores not to collect entitlement checks from the government, but to make a new life because they were freeing some form of religious persecution. Not all of them, but many of them. In other words, so they're like, hey, if I don't make my life myself, government's not going to do it. If I don't build a hut, if I don't shoot some food, if I don't catch some food in the ocean, if I don't grow some, we're done. Okay? Yeah. So that, you know, Alexis de Tocqueville in his Democracy in America said this. He said, when an American decides to do something, like build a barn, they make a plan, they start building it, they might elicit the help of their community, but they never once think of going to the government to get it done for them. They just do it. And he said, now, perhaps what they build is not as big as what the government could have done with all of its resources, but that multiplied millions of people throughout the country doing that does something and builds something far greater than what the government could ever do. That is how conservative Protestants look at stuff, building stuff, initiative, businesses. In other words, I'm not waiting for the government to do it. I'm going to just go do it. Okay? But again, FDR says, no, you're not free. You mean to tell me all of those Puritans and Pilgrims that are on America's shores, in the 1620s, they weren't free? Yeah, he's saying they're not free because you're needy. In other words, it's a totally dramatic way of thinking about all kinds of stuff. Okay? It's a different view of liberty. It's liberty through government. It's freedom through government. Whereas conservatives would say, no, it's freedom from government so I can build the life I want. I don't need government to tell me what to do. I don't need government to tell me about my health. If I want to get a vaccine or not, that's my choice. Or if I want to use the language of abortionists, it's my body, it's my choice. Yeah, anyway. Okay? Make sense?
The thing is that, look at all of these entrepreneurs we had. Now they're not anymore in existence because government has broken them. Literally broken them. Everything that they worked for, they figured they wouldn't have to rely on the government. Well, now they got to rely on the government because the government has destroyed everything they had. They have nothing. They're losing homes. They've lost their businesses. They have no way of supporting themselves now, and they can't go out and get jobs. So what do? They sit back and they take the $300 or $600, whatever the government's giving
Right,
them now.
and it starts changing your mind. It's a social engineering project to get people to rely on government further.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's
I mean,
exactly
remember
right.
President Obama in, I don't know, it was 2010 or 11? You didn't build that. Remember his famous statement? You didn't build that. If you're an entrepreneur, you got your own business, you had help. You had the government. That is very much that progressive mindset. You can't do anything unless the government does something. They provided the road that you drove on this morning. They provided the bridge you drove over this morning. They provided the internet that you used this morning because the FCC regulated. That's the logic. You can't do anything without the government. Yeah, it's what Alexis de Tocqueville said. Forgive me, I'm fond of Alexis de Tocqueville this morning. In Democracy in America, he said, what will happen if the government starts providing everything? He said, it will keep Americans in perpetual childhood. Instead of growing up and figuring it out themselves, they will continually be beholden to the government, just like a child is to a parent. And they will, and he concludes, I'm paraphrasing, and they will like it.
And that's what they're trying to do
And they will
now.
like it. And he wrote that in 1835, well before the entitlement society were created in Europe, but he nailed it. He said, listen, I can see what's happening. If equality becomes the big thing and everyone wants to be equal with everyone else, and they're looking to the government to be equal in rights and equal in money, he said, it will literally lead to a nation of children.
Well, they're trying to turn
And the
it
government
into a
will be seen
nation
as
now.
the parent. Yeah.
Have you, in your classes at LC, do you see, well, probably the Society we call them rebels, who are going against this? I mean.
Students or
Students.
yeah, there are
Kids at
some.
that age.
I watched.
Because I remember in the, like when I graduated, the 60s and 70s, all that turmoil, there was this rebellious spirit in me, like, no, I'm not taking this anymore. So it's gotta be there
Okay.
somewhere.
Two answers. Number one, yes, I see some. Okay, some that neither nod their heads at me or their eyes are sharp. But the vast majority, no, because of two things: ignorance. That's why I teach. Number two, apathy. Okay, here's one, maybe off the subject. When I talk about the NSA and surveilling, and every one of your text messages, and your internet trails, and all that you're doing is surveilled by the NSA, and they know exactly what you're doing, and they don't care. And the argument is, well, I'm not doing anything wrong, so what's the big deal? So I say, so you're okay with that? And they're okay with that. In other words, that to me is an expression of ignorance and apathy. They don't get it, that a government big enough to do that. And I said, what if the wrong people are at the helm? Are you comfortable with that? Let's go to China. Let's talk about the social credit system and how they surveil their people. And you can't buy or sell unless you are politically correct before the government. I said, what if that goes that way in America? Are you comfortable with that? So that's why I teach. All right, we got to end today. Thank you everyone for being here today. I hope this helped. If not, I'll be here next week. Same bad time, same bad channel.